Her manager sacked her for no reason, and in an hour the situation became intense. Before we dive in, subscribe and like this video if you love justice and transparency. Let's begin. Sandra Adeyemi sat stiffly in the expansive glass-walled office of Brighton & Co., her fingers pressing against the leather of her handbag. The silence between her and Richard Clark was thick, pregnant with unspoken truths. She watched as he shuffled through a stack of papers, pretending to be preoccupied, though she knew he had already made up his mind. The mahogany desk between them was more than just furniture. It was a fortress, a symbol of power, control, and an unspoken hierarchy that Richard thrived on. His pale hands smoothed over the pages, his sharp blue eyes flickering toward her only briefly before looking away, as if her presence alone unsettled him. Finally, he cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "Sandra," he began, his tone clipped and rehearsed, "we've reviewed your performance, and quite frankly, it's not up to the standard we expect here at Brighton & Co." He set the papers down, tapping a pen against his desk. "We've decided to terminate your contract, effective immediately." For a fraction of a second, Sandra froze. Not up to standard? She felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her face unreadable. She had led the firm's most profitable acquisition last quarter, securing a deal that boosted revenue by 30%. She had stayed late, taken on extra tasks, and mentored junior staff, doing twice the work with half the recognition. And now she was being dismissed. She met Richard's gaze head-on. "Is there a specific reason?" Her voice was steady and controlled. Richard sighed theatrically as if he were dealing with a difficult child. "Your attitude, it doesn't align with the company culture." There it was, the elusive, intangible excuse. Your attitude, the same hollow reasoning that had been used to quietly push out others like her. Nothing about her work, her competence, or her achievements, just a vague assertion that left no room for defense. Sandra's jaw clenched. She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was how deeply it would sting. The buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead felt deafening in the heavy silence that followed. Richard leaned back in his chair, relaxed now that the decision had been delivered. He glanced at his watch, eager to move on with his day. Sandra remained seated, unmoving, the cold weight of injustice settling in her chest. The air smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne, but all she could taste was betrayal. Richard pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Helen, send someone to escort Miss Adeyemi out." His voice had lost all pretense of civility. Sandra inhaled slowly, steadying herself. There was no use arguing. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where decisions were made before she even walked through the door. She knew that no matter what she said, Richard had already written the script in his mind. She stood with deliberate slowness, smoothing down the front of her blazer. If she was going to leave, she would do it on her own terms. She slung her handbag over her shoulder and met Richard's gaze once more. His smirk was small, almost smug, like a man who had won a silent battle. Sandra tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "You'll regret this." Richard let out a small chuckle, dismissive and confident. "I doubt that." Sandra didn't reply. She simply turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the polished floor. He thought he had won. What Richard Clark didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that he had just made the gravest mistake of his career. And soon, he would learn exactly who he had just crossed. Subscribe to show you disapprove of Richard's unpleasant attitude. As Sandra walked past the sleek, glass-walled offices, a ripple of tension moved through the corridor. Conversations hushed. Eyes darted toward her, then quickly away. Some colleagues, especially the ones who had always acknowledged her brilliance, looked stricken, their jaws clenched in frustration. Others whispered behind cupped hands, murmuring words that never reached her ears but carried the weight of quiet outrage. Yet, on the other side of the spectrum, some faces betrayed thinly veiled satisfaction. A few of her white colleagues exchanged glances, their smirks small but present. It was the look of people who had just witnessed an unspoken victory, one they wouldn't acknowledge aloud but reveled in nonetheless. She wasn't surprised. She reached her desk, a space she had meticulously curated over the months. A framed picture of her late mother sat next to a small potted plant, both of which had been her silent anchors through the long hours and unfair battles. A stack of neatly organized notes detailed the projects she had spearheaded, each one a testament to her success. The irony wasn't lost on her. A security guard hovered nearby, shifting uncomfortably. Unlike Richard, he wasn't unkind, just doing his job. "You've got 10 minutes, he mumbled, his voice quiet. Sandra nodded, her movements slow and deliberate as she gathered her things. Then a voice cut through the tense silence. "I need to say something." The words came from Michael Okafor, a junior analyst. His voice, usually steady and measured, now carried an edge. Michael, a black man who had learned to keep his head down, looked directly at Richard Clark, who stood near the entrance, arms crossed. "Sandra stood up for me when Mr. Wallace made that racist remark about my accent last month," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. "She reported him. She called it out when the rest of you stayed silent." The room tensed further. People turned to look at Michael, then back at Sandra. A murmur of agreement rose. Another colleague, an older woman from HR, cleared her throat. She fought for maternity leave extensions. She challenged the pay gap. She never let anyone take credit for her work. More voices joined in. "She got us that client Brighton couldn't land for 3 years. She covered my project when my wife was in the hospital. She gave a damn." The atmosphere in the corridor shifted, the collective weight of their words pressing down like an approaching storm. Richard's smirk faltered. Sandra simply listened, absorbing the words, the pent-up grievances spilling out. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about everything she had come to represent. She zipped her bag shut and straightened. Then, without a word to Richard, she pulled out her phone. A single call. It lasted less than 10 seconds. By the time she put the phone back in her pocket, a new kind of silence filled the corridor. One of anticipation, uncertainty, fear. Sandra turned, finally meeting Richard's eyes. "There's going to be a board meeting," she said, her tone unreadable. Richard blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "What? You heard me." And with that, she walked toward the exit, leaving behind a company that thought it had just erased her, when in reality she had only just begun. Richard Clark had always known how to play the game. He had climbed the corporate ladder at Brighton & Co. with a mix of charm, manipulation, and a carefully curated network of allies who, like him, believed in keeping the old order intact. His career was built on strategic sabotage, taking credit for others' work, suppressing talent that threatened his position, and ensuring that only those who looked like him rose through the ranks. For years he had dodged complaints. Whispered accusations of discriminatory hiring practices, unethical deal-making, and outright workplace bullying had never stuck. Human resources looked the other way. The board, comprised mostly of men from the same social circles, as Richard preferred to ignore the issue. Sandra Adeyemi was different, though. From the moment she walked through the doors of Brighton & Co., he had felt an unsettling sense of unease. She carried herself with a quiet authority that defied the limitations he placed on people like her. She was sharp, meticulous, and well-spoken, everything he pretended to be. But what unnerved him the most was her confidence. She wasn't intimidated by him. She didn't shrink under his passive-aggressive comments or condescending tone. She challenged him in meetings, disproved his projections with facts, and worst of all, earned the respect of the younger employees. Richard had been waiting for the perfect excuse to get rid of her, and now he had it. Sandra had returned to the UK under a cloud of grief and suspicion. Her father, Akin Adeyemi, had been a shrewd businessman, a Nigerian entrepreneur who had built Brighton & Co. from the ground up, acquiring majority shares before retreating into the background. Sandra had spent most of her life abroad, managing her own successful ventures, content with her distance from the corporate world her father had navigated. Then he had died. Suddenly. Mysteriously. Sandra knew her father. He had been meticulous about his health, his security, his business dealings. The official reports claimed a heart attack, but the circumstances surrounding his death were too convenient, too well-timed. And when she reviewed the financial reports of Brighton & Co., the irregularities were impossible to ignore. Someone was bleeding the company dry. She had taken the job at Brighton & Co. under an assumed name, wanting to observe from the inside. It hadn't taken long to uncover the corruption. Misallocated funds, missing contracts, and a silent network of bribery that Richard Clark was at the center of. He had been running the company like his personal empire, assuming no one would ever challenge him. But now, he had made his biggest mistake. In 15 minutes, Sandra's legal team had arrived and some members of the board, including the chairman. In the boardroom upstairs, Charles Whitmore, the chairman of Brighton & Co., reviewed the documents Sandra's legal team had just handed over. His face darkened as the pieces fell into place. Sandra Adeyemi wasn't just an employee. She was the rightful owner of the company, and Richard Clark was about to learn exactly how disposable he was. The board meeting started, and Sandra officially introduced herself as the rightful owner using the official documents. Unknown to most of the board members, and they know that what is about to happen will be having great impact on them and the company as a whole. Some of these board members are not ignorant about the corruption and mysterious death of Sandra's father. They choose to ignore for their safety and continuity as a shareholder in the company. Sandra laid her complaints and evidence of corruption going on in the company and revealed Richard's involvement, making a demand that Richard must face the law. While there is the ongoing board meeting, Richard had thought it was about the upcoming event in the company, not giving it a thought. Richard sat in his office, basking in the satisfaction of having finally rid himself of Sandra Adeyemi. He leaned back in his chair, savoring his victory when his office phone rang. It was Helen from reception, her voice unusually tense. "Mr. Clark, you need to report to the boardroom, immediately." Richard frowned. The urgency in her tone unsettled him. He straightened his tie, exhaled, and made his way upstairs. As he entered the boardroom, he froze. The entire board was present, their expressions grim. Charles Whitmore, a man who rarely raised his voice, stood at the head of the table with an air of controlled fury. And sitting beside him was Sandra. She was calm and collected. Her presence sent a ripple of confusion through Richard's mind. What the hell was she doing here? "Take a seat, Richard," Charles ordered. Richard's stomach tightened. He obeyed, his fingers clenching the armrests of his chair. Sandra slid a thick file across the table toward him. "You might want to familiarize yourself with these," she said smoothly. Richard opened the file, and his blood ran cold. The documents inside detailed financial discrepancies, fraudulent transactions, and unauthorized offshore accounts. Every single page pointed back to him. "This is absurd," Richard blurted out. "This is a setup." Charles ignored him. His voice was like a blade. "Before you humiliate yourself further, you should know that Sandra Adeyemi is not just an employee. She is the majority shareholder of Brighton & Co. Following her father's passing, she inherited a controlling interest in this company, which means," Charles paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "she owns you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard felt the room spinning. His entire career, his power, his influence, all of it, rested on a foundation that had just crumbled beneath him. Sandra leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "I've spent months uncovering the corruption you've been running here. Overpriced vendor contracts, ghost employees, personal expenses disguised as business costs." She shook her head. "You thought no one would ever notice." Richard's face turned red. "You." She cut him off. "You assumed I was just another black woman you could discard, that I was powerless, but you were never the one in control." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Some had suspected Richard's dealings, but had chosen to stay silent. Now, they were witnessing his downfall in real time. Charles folded his arms. "Effective immediately, Richard, you are suspended pending further investigation. You will leave the premises today." Richard shot up from his chair. "You can't do this. I built this company." Sandra's expression remained unreadable. "No, my father built this company. You just exploited it." A private investigator and 2 law enforcement agents with the company's security guards entered the room. "Mr. Clark," one of the agents said, "you are under arrest for the murder of engineer Adeyemi." Richard's jaw clenched, his mind racing for a way out, but there was none. His reign was over. Sandra had only hired the private investigator some months ago, when the CEO, Mr. Charles, told her to be careful that her father was murdered. He stated that her father planned to do a count audit and also planned to lay off some entitled workers due to cases of falsifying their products and other corrupt practices. With the help of Sandra and some of her father's loyal employees, There were evidences that shows Richard's involvement in the murder of engineer Adeyemi. Richard knew that will be his end, so he started mentioning names of board members that had sent him to do such evil. The mentioned names were denying their involvement with Richard, claiming that there is no evidence to prove their involvement. Unknown to them, Richard has been keeping audio records, files, and pictures of their meeting and conversation due to how shady and wicked they can be. Richard told the officers where to get the evidence, and the board members were speechless. The board members he had mentioned were arrested and escorted out. Richard was also arrested and escorted out the same way he had tried to force Sandra out just an hour ago. Only now the whispers in the hallway were different. No one pitied him. No one stopped him. He was nothing. As Richard disappeared down the hall, Charles turned to Sandra. "What do you want to do next?" Sandra exhaled, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "Rebuild, properly this time. No more corruption, no more backdoor deals." She stood up and smoothed out her blazer, believing the battle had been won, and the real work was just beginning. Brighton & Co. is hers now, and she is going to make sure it thrived, not just for herself, but for every person Richard had ever tried to silence. If you love how justice prevailed, like and subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to tell us in the comment section where you're watching from. Thanks for watching.